So when you are working with recycled materials or upcycled materials like these magazine dowels or magazine tubes or straws or rolls or whatever you want to call them, there are a few things that you can make, one of which is a coil bowl. So I'm going to show you how to make a coiled bowl using these materials. So we'll just move some of these out of the way. And I always start with one that's maybe less interesting, plain white, and save the color ones for more visible materials. So this is going to be the base of the bowl. And the first thing you're going to do when you take your tube is flatten it. So you just press it down so that it is now flat and doesn't really have much of an opening. So for comparison, this one will pretty much look the same. So you have the straw that's like very rounded, and then once you flatten it, there's not much of an opening. So that's what you're looking for. Other materials you're going to want to have would be some tape, especially if you're going to start and not finish this in one sitting. So some painter's tape or repositional tape is going to be helpful, and then some glue. So you could try to use a glue stick, but a lot of times glue sticks aren't strong enough, so you could also use white glue. You just have to be aware of the drying time. Okay, so usually when you have these, there's a bit of a seam where it was glued together, and I always try to keep that seam unexposed. So you want your nice edge on the outside and your seam on the inside, and all you're going to do is you're going to just fold this up, and that first fold is a little bit tricky because it can be hard to do. So you fold that up, and then you're just going to keep coiling it. And this first one, because it's so tight, so small, it is going to be the more difficult one to do. So once you have it established, it does get easier as it gets bigger. Okay, so there's your first coil. This is where the tape is really helpful because you can use it to hold your coil together while you're getting another piece of material. So you can take your tape and it's going to just hold that in place so that you don't lose all of your work, and then flatten another piece. Okay, this time I am going to apply a little bit of glue because it will have some overlapping. So take your tape off. Be really careful not to unravel your coil, and then you're going to attach the new piece to the existing one. And this is where you need to be a little patient. You'll have to hold it to let that glue dry. Okay, and then keep wrapping your coil. And as you wrap your coil, if your glue hasn't completely dried, that's okay, because the pressure of the coil is going to, hold that together a little bit more as well. So just keep going. And again, you can use your tape to hold it in place. Now, if you know you're going to be sitting for a while, you could actually prep a bunch of your rolled magazine to flatten them in advance. So I'm going to actually do that right now, just so that we're not taping it every time. Now, before you do any manipulation to this to turn it into a bowl, you are going to want to let this fully dry, and I would suggest that you let it sit for like 24 hours at least before you do any manipulation, so that way you know that that glue is completely dry. So what I'm going to do now is take my tape and tape down the end, and then this end that's also still very wet, I'm going to tape down that end as well. And this is why it's important to have repositional tape like painter's tape, because you don't want your tape, if you were to use like masking or scotch tape, to not be able to remove it later. So now that I have the two ends taped down, I want to really make sure that this keeps its form, and I'm going to even go one step further and go around the outer edge. So I'm going to just go from this part here, and I'm just going to run this tape all the way around. And this is more of a precaution. It's a little bit excessive, but I want to really make sure that this doesn't pop apart while it's drying and ruin all of that hard work. Okay, so we're going to set this aside and revisit this in 24 hours. Okay, so this has had plenty of time to dry. I've removed the tape, and now we are going to turn this into a bowl. So to do that, you just very carefully start shifting the coil to raise parts up. So we're going to just push down a little in the middle, and then just very carefully, very slowly turn, and you're basically building the sides of the bowl. And this is going to be a little bit of a shallow bowl because we did not go very wide on our coil, but if you had kept going and going and going, you can get a really large, significantly large bowl. Okay. And I'm just really watching to be aware if there's any parts that seem to be separating. I don't want them to completely pop out, and then that would actually ruin the bowl, because it would undo, the whole coil would come undone, so you don't want that to happen. If anything seems like it got glued together, it's better to not force it, because you don't want to break whatever you've already made. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a shallow bowl for this one, but it is definitely a bowl, and it's very fragile still at this state. It's easy to crush, it could be easy to pop apart. So what we want to do is give this a little bit more permanence. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to coat the entire thing with some Mod Podge. Now normally I use gloss, but I'm all out of gloss, so I'm using a matte version. When working with Mod Podge, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. One is you want to protect your work surface. So I'm just going to put the bowl onto a little plastic lid. And this is going to protect the surface and make it easier to move this someplace to dry. And then the other thing is that Mod Podge does have a bit of an odor, so there are some fumes. If you are sensitive to fumes or using this with a full class, make sure to ventilate. And also the brush that you're using, you don't want to use your best brushes. You want to use some brushes that you don't necessarily care about. Okay, so I'm just going to start coating the entire thing. and this will dry clear. So coat the entire inside and then flip it over and do the same thing for the outside. The Mod Podge acts as both a glue and a sealant. So as you are applying it to the bowl, you want to try to get into all of the little creases and crevices in between the pieces, and it's going to really secure everything in place. That's your objective for applying the Mod Podge and applying it fairly thickly. And here is the finished result. This bowl dried for a few hours. To play it safe, I would let it dry overnight, but once it is completely dry, it is very solid. You cannot adjust the shape of this bowl once it has been completed.